Thank you for having me. I think for what I see, some of the participants are familiar with the OntoSoft project, which is great. But I will review a bit of background about the project and the kind of work that we're doing. And I want to talk about using semantics to build registries of models, in particular to support model comparison and reuse. So typically, we see software repositories and software registries where one can deposit the software, where one can find the software and maybe even run it. But it's much harder to compare two models or two pieces of software and figure out how to reuse them. That tends to take a long time. So we're focusing on those topics. So I'll spend some time reviewing past work, but also talk about new work that we're doing. We started the OntoSoft project under the EarthCube program at the National Science Foundation, and we're now also using it for a project that we have with DARPA called World Modelers. I'll talk about that as well. So I'll start talking about the value of software in geosciences very briefly because of this audience. Obviously, if you're attending a scientific software group, you understand this value. I'll talk about OntoSoft, how it works, how we use it as a software registry for science. I'll talk about work that we did on disseminating best practices for software. So even if we have these repositories, if we don't raise awareness in the scientific community about the value of software, the value of sharing software, it would be hard to get these repositories well populated. So I'll talk about an effort called the Geoscience Papers of the Future and give an example through a paper of how we are disseminating these best practices. And then finally, I'll talk about model comparison and reuse by using semantics. So these are new requirements that we have now for OntoSoft. So let me start with the value of software in geosciences. I have a cartoon here about how typically a grad student will be asked to continue some work, and that means building on prior work from someone from their group or some other group, and it's kind of a good luck conversation. You know, I hope that you can do well. So this is a very common situation. At the same time, I'm showing here some results from a Nature Metrics survey some years ago that showed that one of the top things that scientists want to get credit for, you see that in the center here, is software, the software that they post as research resources for the scientific community. So software is way out there, way up in the list after publications and grants. And way down in the list, you can see it at the very, very bottom on the right, is the data that they deposit. So this would indicate that scientists value their contributions as software that they write much more highly than the data that they generate for the community. This was very interesting to me. So today, when scientists share software, it's always in a limited way. There are some repositories of model software. So CSCMS is one for surface dynamics. CIG, ESMF are some of the most widely used ones. There's many others. There are no shared repositories for other kinds of software that are not model software. So if you're looking for visualization or some data preparation software, that's much harder to find. And for those, you may find something in general software repositories. So GitHub is a good example, the R repositories, but there's little metadata to help discover and reuse that software. A big problem is that most scientists are not aware of the value of their software. So if you've spent years writing a model, you understand that the software that you've written is of value. But if you don't spend many years writing the software, that's much harder to convey. And so in most cases, software is not shared in geosciences. So some of the project goals that we started with in OntoSoft were threefold. One is to design a registry where we could really represent what software in geosciences does, how is it used, from the point of view of a scientist. So sometimes when models or code are described, they're really described from the point of view of a software developer. So there's a lot of details and instructions about how to run the software, but not so much about the assumptions or the design of the software or how to use it in a science context. Those things are relegated to publications, and those are not always complete. We also wanted to have intelligence assistance to help a scientist, and also ways to recommend and search through the software. A second goal of OntoSoft is to raise awareness on the value of software in the community from the point of view of getting credit for software, the use of software as a means for reproducibility, and also reusing software to accelerate research. And then finally, train the community on best practices for open source software and software sharing. So I'll talk about each of these topics in the next few slides. The first thing that we did is worry about how do we represent the properties of software that are relevant to scientists. So we did a lot of use cases and studies that led to the design of an ontology that describes properties of software that are interesting to a scientist. And we group them into 6 major categories. So one is identifying that the software is what we're looking for, if we have some identifier for it, or we know who the author was. Another is to understand what the software does and how it works. Another one is to execute it, to run it. So accessing the software, installing and running it. Then doing research with it. That means that you want to run the software with your own data. You want to compose it with other software, and then finally cite it, and then get support and possibly contribute to software updates or get software updates. So those are major categories, and we went through those and created an ontology that we call the OntoSoft ontology. There's a pointer to it on the screen, and it's available in the OWL standard. There's extensive documentation for all of the terms. It is a basis for the design of the OntoSoft registry. We use it as an API for external access, and we've done a crosswalk to software metadata that appears in schema.org and GitHub, DataSide, and many others. So the ontology is used in this portal. You can recognize that kind of pie diagram. And we're showing the pie more or less filled up in each of the segments, depending on how much metadata is provided. Some metadata is optional, but we use that as an indicator of metadata completeness. And this design came from a previous design that didn't work very well, where it was hard for scientists to understand why they needed to provide a certain piece of information. And we think that this conveys that much better. We fill in the properties through questions, and we can import metadata from other repositories. So if you give a URL to your GitHub, then it will get automatically information about the license and other things. We also have a way to crowdsource software metadata. So if you did not write, in this case, this is a software called 3DDY. If you didn't write this software, but you use it, or you're part of the community that is familiar with it, you may also contribute metadata for this software. Sometimes, if you use it a lot, you may know that the instructions to run it may be missing something, or you may use it in a different environment where you found the hard way about something useful, or some assumption that helps understand how to use it. So we have an entire framework to give permissions to different users in the portal to be able to update the properties. The architecture of OntoSoft is very distributed. So basically what we have is a number of registries. Each registry is run by a different community, and they're all interlinked through the main OntoSoft portal. So we indicate right before the name of the software, you see it in the blue, larger blue screen, which is the main OntoSoft portal. We indicate the portal, the specific community where it comes from, so that you can actually go there. And the minute that you click there, you jump into the specific portal. You can only edit those where you have login access to the portal because you're part of that community in some way. The other thing that we did is look at comparing different entries. And so you can see here the comparison metrics for hydrology software in C++ with the Apache license 2.0. It finds all the results, and it lets you contrast it by the different properties, how the software stacks up for these different models, so that it makes it easier for you to look for it and find what you're looking for. So OntoSoft provides a metadata registry for software. It complements code repositories. We don't store any code in OntoSoft. It's just the metadata. The code resides in software repositories. So whether it's GitHub or CSCMS or some R repository. And actually, all the metadata that you put in OntoSoft, you can export in HTML or XML or JSON and put it in the in your own code site. So it's very compatible with those. It's not meant to replace them in any way. They have a very different function. I want to show you a study that Bakina Messaoui, John Goodall, and others did on using OntoSoft to describe hydrology models, in particular a hydrology model called VIC, Variable Infiltration Capacity, from the University of Washington. And so what they did is look through papers, publications, and also websites, source code, and started to document all the metadata for this and other models. And they found very interestingly that along the 6 dimensions in the OntoSoft ontology for software metadata that you see here, the information appeared in different places. So sometimes discussions among users, sometimes the website, sometimes publications, and sometimes in the source code itself. So the information is really, you have to look at 5 different kinds of places to really find the information that you need. So we really think that there's a benefit to explicitly and centrally capture all of this software metadata. So that's kind of an overview of the OntoSoft portal. I want to talk a bit about what we've done to disseminate best practices for software in the geoscience papers of the future. So this was an initiative that the OntoSoft project took to create an early career advisory board of about 30 scientists that were interested in improving their own practices with respect to software. So one of the things that we found very early on is that when we would say, let's have a training session or a tutorial on best practices for software, everybody was too busy to do this. It's like, how many hours are you asking for? What is it that I need to do? So what we found is that learning to incorporate best practices into a paper that you are writing is a much more appealing way for them to really learn in practice what to do with their software. So this led to an initiative that we call the Geoscience Papers of the Future about how to incorporate these best practices in writing papers. We did this through 2 different ways. One is to have a special issue of a general AGU journal, the Earth and Space Science Journal, where papers written along these lines would be reviewed and published according to these best practices. And then we've been holding training sessions in these best practices at conferences, also at universities and organizations and government sites. So there is a paper that summarizes these best practices there is a special issue with a number of papers in different areas of geosciences published, and just an articulation that the best practices are concerning making publications reproducible, practicing open science, and also digital scholarship. So these have different aspects, and I'll talk about those in a second. So these are the three aspects that I mentioned. One is making research reproducible. So usually when we talk about software, we talk about making the software available. This is not sufficient. Sometimes you're running the same software twice to make some comparisons. Sometimes you have steps that you take to run the software. So we want to really see the entire workflow, the entire set of steps and how the software is interdependent. We also want to see the experimental design. So these screenshots are from another project that we have, but essentially the idea is to capture the hypotheses, the ways that you design the experiment, the kinds of data that you sought out, and then the design of the workflow, the assimilation of the results of the workflow, and so on. So just the design of the experiments is also important for that. The software that you use, you have to describe in terms of the methodology of that experimental design. The second aspect is open science. So we want the software to be not just published, but published in the shared repository. A lot of geoscientists publish software in their own websites or in their project sites, and that's not a shared repository that is archival and remains with the paper. So we recommend using these kinds of shared repositories. The software should have a persistent unique identifier. So both the software and data or samples and other aspects of research, sometimes workflows are published with unique identifiers as well. So just putting something on a regular URL is not a good idea. We prefer DOIs and Perl. And then finally, assigning a license to the software. The third aspect is digital scholarship. So you want the software to be cited. You want to have metadata in the repository, the authors, and the identifier of the software to be included in the publication. The most important thing about software is to include the version. So data sets don't typically have versions, but software does, and that's a very important thing to include. Sometimes the software itself can be associated with a publication about the software rather than a publication about a certain piece of scientific research, and so that's also possible. So these three things are very important, and there's kind of the pillars of the paper of the future. I think that a lot of scientists think about including data, so that has become a feature of modern papers, but I think these other three pillars are very important to worry about. So what I want to do is give you an example by critiquing a paper by Aaron Ridley and colleagues from the University of Michigan that we presented at the CEDAR conference on geospace science last summer. And we worked with Aaron and the InGeo EarthCube project to do this. So this is a paper on simulating electron and ion temperature. Really what it does is it presents a new version of a particular model called GIDM, and it compares it with the previous version of the model. It compares GIDM with another model called IRI and its behavior in several sites. And then it kind of stretches the GIDM model by using it to investigate a substorm in the ionosphere. So those are the main aspects. So in the sense of data, the paper, which I have quotes on the left, it talks about some of the data sets that were used, but there's other data sets that are missing. So they know, because they are in the community, what sources were used or in general where to look for them, but not necessarily, someone else reading the paper would have a hard time, just chasing these data sources. There's another example, which is this idealized substorm, which they generated sorry, I just messed up the projection. This idealized substorm, which they generated by just running some software that generated it, but there's no pointer to the substorm that was used. There's also no pointer to the data and the plots about the substorm, although there's a pointer to a paper that describes the substorm that has the data, but never the software. So really the best practices are not followed. There's not a unique identifier, DOI. There's no licenses. The data is not cited. So even the best practices for data are not followed. In terms of software, as I mentioned, the idealized substorm software that was used to generate it is not anywhere mentioned. The paper talks about the old and the new GitHub model, but there's no pointers to the software itself. So the software is actually kept in a community repository that I'll show you in a minute, but there's no notion of versions, and it's hard to access the prior versions. So there's not a DOI that you can uniquely access and see those older versions. So the comparison is really, done by the authors, a conceptual comparison in the paper, but it's hard for others to rerun that. There's also a pointer that you see here in the second bullet on the left, talking about comparing the model with another model called IRI, but it doesn't say what version of IRI is used. And so it makes it hard to figure out exactly what version it is that one is supposed to compare it with. There are no licenses, there's no metadata for the software, and there's no citation for the software. This is an example of where this IRI software is documented. They have a software repository where you can actually run the models, and there's no notion of the version. So you're basically selecting data sets to run the model and then just running it. And I guess, there's a version of 2007 referred to here, but it's not clear that that's the same version as the paper was talking about. This is the GitHub version, the GitHub model. There's no way to access an older model or to identify older versions uniquely. You have to kind of do that detective work. And then in terms of the workflow, the text is shown on the left. So it's comparing various variables using the old model, the new model, and the IRI model. And there's no details about the specific workflow. So for example, on the right, the best practices would be to have really the sketch of the workflow. And one of the things that you can see immediately is that probably the three models got the same input data, but it's unclear that they got the same parameters. So in this workflow, each model has a different set of parameters. It's unclear how much they were harmonized or coordinated. And then finally, provenance of execution results. There are figures and discussions about how the models work in specific sites, but it's hard to see specifically what the parameters used were because there's no mention of them in the paper. So that's kind of the state of the art in terms of how software is treated in geosciences. It's very hard to see that software is treated as a first-class product of scientific research, even though these models are really key to the science. So the geoscience paper of the future has been growing. There was also a special issue on the geophysics journal on papers of the future. It's been transferred into neuroscience and neuroimaging on specific requirements for their science in terms of how to describe software and experiments. So we're very excited about this, and we continue to teach it. So if any of you knows of a venue or a place where we can come and share these best practices, we'd be happy to. So I want to talk a little bit looking towards current work and looking towards the future of what we are thinking about with OntoSoft. So looking at software comparison and reuse. This is in the context of a new project that we have called MINT for model integration. The idea is to accelerate how long it takes to build an integrated model. So in our work, we're looking at linking climate with hydrology, with agriculture, with economic, with social models. And we want to study the impact of climate in certain regions. So here's a picture of the Mekong River. It cuts across 9 different countries. There's a lot of dams being built. There's a lot of economy depending on fisheries and agriculture that are going to be impacted by those dams, but also by climate dynamics. And so to really understand the impact on the population of these changes, you have to integrate models across all these disciplines. And typically it would take, in the order of 2 years to really get all the models together and work out how to do the shared data and the data exchange and setting up the models and so on and so forth. So the diversity is enormous across the disciplines. The diversity is in the way that modeling is approached, the representative models and how they work, the kinds of variables that the models use, and the kinds of frameworks that are typically used to compare or integrate models. The data is also, of course, very diverse, and there's a range of availability. So model integration becomes very hard. How can we make it easier? And so in the orange side of the slide, we describe the main research aspects of the project. So first, can we describe model variables that matter to study a situation? So what are the salient variables that are important for me to study this? Then we want to select models that address those variables, that will generate predictions for those variables. We want to get data that are relevant to those models. We want to get data to parameterize those models, and the higher quality, the better. And then we want to be able to run different scenarios. So all of these aspects require different sides of AI. So we're using a lot of ontologies, machine learning, really a lot of semantics to guide these steps. I want to show you an example. So here's a simple scenario where you're looking at some particular area and you're trying to articulate in this graph the variables that are of interest. So you know that there's going to be precipitation affecting soil moisture, which will affect crop yields, which will be affected by the soil quality, the property rights as well, and all of this has impacts on land use. And the land use affects albedo, which will affect also future precipitation. So there's a number of variables that you're interested in understanding in this case. And what we do is we use these variables to find models that could help us understand that. So each of the colors indicates a different discipline. So there's a weather simulator that is relevant to look at precipitation. There may be different hydrology models shown in blue, different agriculture models shown in green, and then different models of crop delivery based on the transportation and accessibility, and then models of land use as well on the socioeconomic side. So these are possibly different kinds of models that one can select and combine into different workflows to study these scenarios. Each of these possible workflows may have data requirements that cannot be met, or maybe granularity that is not going to give us the most accurate predictions. So there's quite a bit of work that one needs to do in creating these workflows and adjusting them. So that's part of what we're worrying about in the project. And really any single one of these workflows is trying to reuse and compose models. So here you have the weather simulation generating precipitation, which you have to convert into a format that then the hydrology model can use. The hydrology model may output soil moisture that goes into the agriculture model, but you'll have to convert it as well. So this is a very cartoonish way to show a lot of data transformations in these star-shaped steps, a lot of models from different disciplines, each talking about possibly common variables, but in different ways. So what we're unveiling as requirements for OntoSoft is 4 specific requirements that I'll walk through quickly. One is exposing the model variables so that we can match the models to these initial variables of interest. Ways to map variables across models so that we can build these workflows appropriately. Representing the semantic structure of model invocation, so how those variables correspond to input files and so on. And then finally, capturing data pre-processing as workflow fragments. So all of these aspects we think have to be included in model repositories such as OntoSoft. So the first topic was exposing model variables. So here, what we're thinking about is creating a variable dependency graph based on the model. So on the left is just some excerpt of text that describes different variables that are used in a model. And then on the right is kind of a cartoon representation of a lot of variables that are incorporated in the model. So what we really want is to be able to say what variables are present in a model and what their dependencies are. And if other models use variables that are overlapping, we want to make sure that their treatment is consistent. So it's important to expose the model variables, not just inputs and outputs, but any internal variables as well. The second is to be able to map variables across models. So here we're collaborating with Scott Peckham. He's been developing an ontology called the Geosciences Standard Names Ontology. Some of you are familiar with his work, but it's basically a way to map variables from different models that refer to the same quantity. So in this case, one model may talk about stream flow, another about discharge, and they're both variables mapped to a standard way to refer to the outflow rate of a watershed. This is very important for us to make the models understandable and to make them correspond. So we've been characterizing model variables and annotating the internal variable of the model with the standard way to describe it. The third aspect is to represent the semantic structure of the model invocation. So we want to be able to capture for each of the input files or output files, what are the variables that are captured in that file. If it's a time series, we want to capture that in its type or format, the temporal or spatial grid and the characteristics of that grid. We want to also characterize the variable in terms of the standard name, the values, the units, and other relevant semantic aspects. And then the model should have a link to this variable dependency graph as well. So this is to really represent the structure of the invocation. And then finally, to be able to capture data pre-processing workflows. So the idea would be to not just have a model, so these are examples from ModFlow, not just have ModFlow in a certain version as an entry in the catalog, but also really have these preparation steps and preparation workflows associated with the model. And you can see here highlighted in black kind of the differences between two versions of ModFlow that show you that there's a lot of reuse in these sub-workflows. So we want to be able to compare, if I use one version of ModFlow versus another, how much work would it be to use both? How different are these pre-processing workflows now? And then on the right, it's a completely different model, Mike Shea, and there I would have to use a, very different kind of pre-processing workflow, but there's some steps that are the same. So we want to be able to compare and understand this, because when you're comparing models, all of the things highlighted in black show extra work that you have to do those comparisons. So in conclusion, geosciences software is a very valuable research product, and we must embed best practices into research activities and disseminate these best practices. OntoSoft is a repository of software metadata, so it's a software registry. You can browse, search, and enter descriptions about software. It's very easy to open an account and add new entries. You can export the metadata at the end and put it in your GitHub or your favorite place where you keep the code. It's easy to learn best practices for software sharing and citation and write a geoscience paper of the future. There's a lot of documentation and exemplars to be followed. Community leads interested in these best practices can set up an OntoSoft portal and hold geoscience paper of the future training. And then the developers can use the OntoSoft ontology and develop APIs and applications based on it. And there's a lot of new work that we're doing on extending OntoSoft with more semantic description. And that's all I have. I want to leave plenty of time with questions, and there's a lot of people to thank, so I'll let you stare at the screen as the questions take place. Thank you.
All right, Yolanda, thank you very much. Very full talk, I should say. I have a lot of questions myself. Who wants to go first? Hello? Annie, can
Yolanda,
you hear me? Oh, yeah.
Hi, Steve Richard here. Yolanda, do you have any kind of analytics about how people are using the OntoSoft registry at this point?
No, we're not collecting a lot of analytics. So what we are mostly collecting is a lot of interest. I think you really have to have community buy-in to make this kind of effort worthy. So there has to be a, kind of a, you have to reach a point where having everybody share this information is valuable, and you can use the information from others. So if it's just you posting the information, it's not as valuable. And so we're trying to at least populate one catalog of hydrology models. That's what we've been focusing on, so that there's value, at least for hydrology. And we've been working with USGS and UT Austin and others in this regard. The geospace community, I just showed you that paper from Geospace. They are a relatively small community that is pretty well organized, and they are moving very fast in this direction. So I think that they will take their software repository and start to extend it in this way. But it really, for us, it's a research project that we really want to just investigate and offer the possibility. We've set up the portal for a lot of communities in EarthCube. It's hard for us to tell, what would it take to get one of these communities to adopt this or to really, get engaged. And that's something hard to do. But I think the geospace and the hydrology areas might be the most promising.
Anyone else?
Yolanda.
Yeah, Yolanda.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
This is Ken Bagstad from USGS. I'm just curious what software platform you're using for that model integration and how you're managing to pull data. Are there data repositories that you're accessing in order to accomplish all of that integration?
Yeah, so that's a pretty big project, and what we're doing is populate the system with data for specific regions. So we're building on a platform called Hydrater. So this is a platform from Penn State, from Chris Duffy, where all the data for a specific region can be stored. We've also done a lot of work on socioeconomic data sources like FAO and others. So really the idea is to set up the platform for specific regions So you could imagine a state, for example, California or Texas, and have all the data available. The data will be in different formats. The data will be very heterogeneous, but at least the data is available. It's a 4-year project, so part of the ambition is to be able to describe these input data formats that the models take and be able to use AI planning techniques to generate data transformations automatically. So we've done this for smaller domains. We have a lot of workflow reasoners as well, so that's part of our ambition. But it would be a place where a user can point to data sources, as they are available, and then the system would work with the user to transform and use the data and fit it to the model. So we're looking at international destinations. So we're looking at Central Africa, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa. I showed you the example of Southeast Asia. So different areas of the globe. I think the U.S. is kind of an easy data target. So we're focusing in other areas.
Yolanda, Steve Richard again. What was the name of the platform you said you were using, and could you tell us a little more about what it offers?
So are you talking about this project, this platform?
Is that from Penn State? That's Chris Duffy's, the Penn State platform?
Oh, okay. It's called Hydrater. Let me see if I can write it in the chat. Hydrater. So Hydrater is a data repository. So we're augmenting that with a data registry to be able to describe with metadata what the data sources contain. So again, we've done a lot of AI work, and this is work from Craig Knobloch's group here at ISI. He's done a lot of work to learn semantics and metadata descriptions for data sources. So if you have a number of data sources in the system that have, where you've already annotated certain columns as temperature, and you get a new tabular file, the system will look at the columns and say, oh, that looks a lot like temperature. And that looks a lot like barometric pressure. So it does a lot in terms of learning from the examples that it has seen in order to generate metadata for new sources. So there's a lot of aspects of the model integration process that we think we can automate.
Yolanda, this is Jim. I have a question about OntoSoft. We had a speaker May of last year, Kate Keehee of Software X, which is a new journal from Elsevier, and it's been designed to support the publication of software and metadata about software, et cetera, in a journal format. And I was curious if you had any interaction with them or are interested in that, because it seems like they're coming at the sort of the same problem from a completely different angle.
Right. So I think publishing a paper about software is very useful in these journals that have a review process that is friendly towards descriptions of software. Papers are very important. This creates a conundrum, though, because this is the case with many pieces of software that I think we all try to cite. The minute there is a paper about that software, you're citing that paper, but you're not referring to the specific version that you used of that software. So the paper becomes this canonical citation, and different versions of the software may have different authors that you want to cite and get citations to and give credit to. If you want to reproduce the work, you need to know exactly what version was used. So I think that the journal papers about software are useful and important, and they've been happening forever. I think that these specific journals have a more friendly review process for software papers. But there's been software papers for a long time. It's just that that doesn't solve the whole problem.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else?
Yolanda, Steve again. I was wondering, is the for the OntoSoft registry, there's an ontology behind it. How is it configurable? Let's say if you wanted to adapt the registry for registering other things besides software.
You know, that's a very interesting question, because I think we've been asked this question before. I'm trying to go back to it. We've been asked this question before. That's something that we would be very interested to do. So certainly, you know, you could imagine we're very focused on scientific software. So software that scientists would write that does some scientific task. It's not meant to describe software infrastructure. So, for example, a workflow system or a data service or things like that. But one could imagine extending it for that. Yeah, so the ontology has these different modules, and it's pretty well documented, I think. So I think that would be a very valuable thing to stretch it to describe other kinds of resources.
Okay, so it should be doable for software. Of course, it's doable. It's just how much work is it, right?
I would think so. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
This is Jim again. I've just been thinking about this issue of versioning, because I'm always asking people to publish the version of the software they use. But our products, and this is generally true of, you know, of science software, change continuously, right? There's new versions every month, if not more frequently, in many cases. And so even at OntoSoft, how is that handled in terms of the metadata, if it's continually being new versions being generated?
Yeah, so this is something that is very challenging, and I don't think that is really well addressed. So, for example, if you look at data, right, a lot of data sets are kind of dynamic. They continue to grow over time. So I know that, for example, the ESIP data cluster has had some thoughts and recommendations about how to best describe dynamic data sets, and we don't have a lot of that in terms of software. So I have a PhD student working on describing different versions of software, being able to compare them, being able to upgrade, basically being able to upgrade your analysis to a new version of the software easily. And this turns out to be very challenging. And he's been looking, for example, at ModFlow, which is a model that has evolved tremendously and has many different incarnations and versions, and some of them are radically different. And so, characterizing and comparing these different versions of the software is a challenging problem. So typically, we think about comparing different versions as a software artifact, right? So this version had this issue, now it doesn't, or this version had this function, this other one doesn't, or things like that. But I think there's additional things in terms of assumptions and you know, these pre-processing workflows that can be very different across versions. So really characterizing different versions well and being able to compare them and reuse them is, I think, a task that everybody does all the time, and it takes a lot of time. So the more we're able to characterize those differences, the easier it will be.
I think, you know, one tool to assist that is if people are using a version control system and make meaningful commit messages about changes that they're doing, and do it frequently, that you have a trail anyway that can be mined for answering that question at some level, the one you posed to your grad student.
Yes, and I think that's another very good point, which is that the kind of the integration of the software development environment with these software registries and the software metadata, right? So right now, this is very separate from a software development environment, but it would be useful if it were more integrated.
Yes. So we're coming up on our hour here, and I want to ask if anyone has another question or two. I see Kristen, you got one?
Yes, a quick question, I think. I noticed in the OntoSoft portals that there's a place to assign keywords. I'm wondering if there is a controlled vocabulary, say, that OntoSoft users refer to when choosing those keywords, or does each OntoSoft portal develop their own keyword list?
That's a very good question. So we always offer the community, when we set up their portal, if they have particular keywords that they prefer, we can just adopt them. And you know, we've never given a list of keywords to start with or to impose. So we just let the users create those keywords. That's kind of a crowdsourcing approach to compiling keywords. And I have a strong preference for crowdsourcing environments. And in fact, we had a paper last year at the Semantic Web Conference on controlled crowdsourcing. So the idea is that you seed the keywords with some reasonable set of keywords that would make sense to a community, and then you let people add to that as they please. But you have a process to extend the core set of keywords and foster convergence to kind of generate a new version of the standard set of keywords. So right now it's fully crowdsourced, but I think that there's room to do something more reasonable there.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? I want to
thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm always interested in collaborating with people. So if you're interested in any particular aspects, we're always happy to work with people, and I'd be happy to follow up with any of you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for taking the time to share with us. It's been very informative. And I want to mention again to the group here that I think that we have, with Yolanda's presentation and the previous few presentations, some really interesting topics that we might, if we can find a volunteer, seed a breakout session at the summer ESIP. So I'm just planting that meme or seed, and if somebody's interested, please contact me, and we'll go from there. Otherwise, we'll end today. Thank you, Yolanda, and see you in a month for a presentation from Rick Almendinger.